Welcome to Tea Talks Unfiltered, the podcast where we drink tea, we talk, and they're both unfiltered. My name is Jake, and I will be your host. And on today's episode, we are drinking whatever your favorite tea is. And we are going to be discussing how to properly behave in China. Okay, so in a recent episode I did about tea culture, I talked about the subtle way of saying thanks, the light tapping on the table to show your appreciation during a tea ceremony. And I really like this tradition. But after that episode, it got me thinking about all the different kind of social practices, the etiquette in China, especially with Chinese New Year, the Spring Festival just happening this last week, all the different celebrations that are here, all the different traditions that are normal around that time. It just got me thinking about my whole experience in China and putting it underneath the proverbial microscope, right? And I thought it'd be good to kind of explain all these different customs, the different traditions, these practices in everyday life, because there is quite a big impact on these long-term traditions like Feng Shui, the Zodiac signs, with gift giving around the dinner table. I know I've talked about like the hierarchy in the family, the names and titles, and how all these traditions kind of come together to create Chinese culture and how it's lived every day, very, very subtly. But very, very significant and important as well. So I want to talk about that language, that cultural language. That's very much just a common thing every day, an everyday conversation, right? So this will give you some insight into Chinese culture, but also if you can learn these and put these into practice, if you're going to travel to China, maybe you're learning Chinese right now, this is a really, really good way to kind of get yourself an in, to be immediately accepted into any Chinese family. I know that it's one of those things that, like, for example, when in Rome, when in China, you like eat with chopsticks, right? Like if you can reflect some of that culture back to everyone here, it's just a wonderful thing to share in that moment and share in that tradition. So we'll be breaking down, kind of going through a few of these different things, and I'll share with you some stories and some insights that I've had. I think it's a really interesting topic, and Chinese culture is so just diverse and so rich that it's a very interesting subject as well. So I hope you can join me. Ganbei. Okay. So I'm still drinking the mystery tea. I think this is going to be my last week. I have to, hold myself back from just depleting my entire store of it. But I've been drinking it pretty nonstop. So I think this will be my last one. And then after this, when I clean this out, I'll have to change to something different for a little while, so I don't just burn through it all. But I hope that you guys are enjoying some tea. Still saying warm. I think it just was the first day of spring on the solar calendar just 2 days ago here. So nice weather around the corner. We had one more day of a big snow here, but the temperature's slowly building up. So I hope wherever you guys are at, it's starting to get warm. Unless you're in, a different hemisphere, maybe it's starting to cool down a little bit too. So either way, we're getting to some more balanced part of the year, hopefully. So all right, so talking about this subject, I think the easiest place to start with is we need to start with the language. We need to start with the actual colloquialisms, those kinds of, the way people talk here, because there is kind of a lot of ingrained things that happen just in, how people greet each other, how people talk, kind of the approach to the conversation is really important in Chinese culture. I've talked about a few of these things. Like, for example, in a previous episode, I think when I was talking about like becoming a shifu, about the titles and the hierarchy of names, in the family, there is that really important structure, right? So there is kind of a layout, there's kind of a superior person in each relationship, and there's an emphasis on honoring that relationship and kind of respecting your elders and this kind of like tradition that's definitely one of the biggest things in China. Like, it's very, very important to understand that and to have that kind of participation in that relationship, right? Because you're reaffirming your connection to each other by referring to them as your title. For example, if you're going to talk to your uncle, you use the title uncle. specifically of your mother or your father, and the age that he is in the family as well. Like all that comes into play. Even more so if you're in a martial arts school, like I mentioned before, you have terms for your elder Kung Fu brothers, as well as your Sifu, your grandmaster, even your Kung Fu uncles, right? We all have terminology for those different roles, right? And there's a responsibility with each of those. So I've talked about that in a previous episode. I hope you've listened to that one, the how to become a Shifu, and I think just kind of sprinkled in throughout all the episodes. Not so many episodes yet, but it still seems like I've covered a lot of different material. So I hope you guys are enjoying the conversations. If you do have any questions, always feel free to ask. I like having a specific subject to kind of tackle. But some of the other things that I haven't talked about as much in detail is just the way that people kind of start conversations, the way people talk to each other is definitely different in China. For me, coming from the United States, coming from America, there is definitely like a more, how should I say, like there's more of a guideline in the conversation here, where there's kind of a traditional thread that it always takes, like a direction that you start. Whereas in the West, especially in the States, it can be very, very casual. Sometimes I don't really remember even referring to some of my friends by their name for like a very long time, regardless of title or any kind of, kind of responsible relationship. It was always very casual, right? Here, very, very structured in some senses. It doesn't have to be, but again, having that connection is really, really important, especially if you're doing like a business deal, or if you're in a family, or if you're in a martial arts school. Okay, these relationships are very, very important, right? And they have kind of social implications as well, right? But some of the other things that I haven't mentioned as much is just the everyday kind of simple questions that you might receive, right? So I'm going to speak a little bit from my own experience. I know, like being here, I get the kind of purified form of questions. Not that they're like censored. I mean purified in the sense that I get all of the questions, right? Because it's like a brand new conversation. A lot of times I end up being one of the first or few foreigners that a person maybe has ever talked to. So I tend to get like the first and most important questions that come to your mind from a Chinese perspective. But these questions are also the questions that they ask everyone, right? It's just like now they're excited to be able to ask them to someone from a foreign country. So I've answered a lot of these questions a lot. One of the greatest things that you'll have asked to you, which is kind of like the opening to a conversation, is 你吃饭了吗? Which just means, have you eaten? Which I think I mentioned before in some other episodes, but I always think that this is like one of the greatest ways of saying hello, of just starting a conversation with someone, is, have you eaten? Have you eaten yet? And because it just implies this kind of care, right? It shows that, you're considering that person, like making sure they're comfortable, making sure they're kind of just well set and they feel at home wherever they are, right? So this is something like, even you walk by someone on the street, like where in the English, it's very much like, how's it going? The only response is good. You're just supposed to say good. Or if you're not feeling good, you say fine. But that's about as far as you go in the conversation. And this will be the same thing. Like you walk down the street and someone could just ask you, have you eaten yet? And you could just say yes or no. And that's almost the whole conversation, right? Like that could be the passing greeting that you have on the street for someone that you know. And it's just that way of kind of like showing that they're like looking out for you, kind of. But we'll also get to later in the episode about just the dinner table in general, how important it is for Chinese culture in so many ways. And so you see these implications in the way that people talk to each other as well. So that's like, I think that's kind of like the way of telling people I love you in China sometimes, is like where I'm from in the Midwest. Where I am in the Midwest, we always ask people, when you're leaving and you're going home, it's like, for example, you'll say something like, oh, when you get home, call me, make sure that you got home. Or when you go home, look out for deer on the road. These kinds of things that you say in kind of Midwest of America. And these are always kind of like the way of saying, like, I really care about you. I want you to be safe, like make sure when you get home, you call me. Like, I want to make sure you're okay. It's like that subtle way of saying I love you as well. And so, they have these cultural kind of conversational suggestions that I think are really nice, and they're really cool to pay attention to, because it gives you kind of an interesting insight into just the everyday workings, the perspective of everyone, right? That is another thing, because here, I think I've also mentioned this, is there's not really a common occurrence for saying things like please, and thank you, and I love you specifically, especially within a family, like a family unit, right? It's just, it doesn't seem as common. Not that people don't say please and thank you, like people are very polite and welcoming, but it just seems that when you're inside the family and you have those close relationships already established, there does seem to be, especially in the more traditional families, this kind of, you don't necessarily always have to say please for everything. You don't say thank you every time someone serves you. You don't necessarily say I love you that often, it seems. And I think that a lot of the times, like I've even done this within the family. Like if a family member does a favor for me, or goes out of their way to do something, I do. I've been brought up to say thank you and be very polite and have this etiquette, right? But then I've also had them say, like, stop saying thank you. I've had people say, stop saying please. Like within the family, they explained to me that it's just that these things, while they're not expected, there is kind of like this established connection that doesn't necessarily require it, but it is kind of like, I'm helping you because you're part of me. Like you're so close to me that, I have to do this because it's making me feel good too, so you don't need to say thank you. You don't need to say please for everything. I know when I first came here, I mentioned this before, of saying the polite version of hello and the polite version of different terms. And no one ever really does that unless it's in some kind of professional relationship. Okay, there's a little bit of a standard for that, but in the everyday kind of personal relationship, it's less so, right? And so I think that's kind of another nice little thing where it's just, you don't need to say these things a lot because they're implied, because there's this not just giving and receiving, but there's always that intention of I'm looking out for you in some way, right? And so I do really, really like this kind of habit, I would say, this connection. Although there are a lot of things in China that will be a lot more direct than most people are used to, right? So you'll get asked a lot of personal questions as seen by Western standings. Like, for example, the famous questions. You'll get asked, how old are you? You'll get asked, how much money do you make? You'll get asked, or why aren't you married yet? Why don't you have kids yet? You'll get kind of these very, very direct, by Western terms, sometimes very personal questions asked, right? Like, how much is your salary? That's a question that will come up, how heavy are you? Or maybe not necessarily direct questions, but direct references. Like Chinese culture, there is like this idea that I think is really important, is just the amount of people that are here, for one, makes it so there isn't really a private bubble always, right? There isn't this idea of, there is private space, of course, but in the social world, there is kind of this, definitely a smaller bubble, right? And so there's less personal space in some sense, to where you're not really stepping on someone's toes all the time by asking these questions. Again, it's not necessarily culturally encouraged, but it does happen quite a lot. You get these very direct questions, and it's not really seen as aggressive or bad for you. There is an aspect of saving face as well. So there is this kind of idea of making each other look good and trying to have good relationships with everyone. But even with that in mind, these questions aren't crossing that border, right? You're not stepping on anyone's toe by asking these really direct questions, right? By Western standards, if you ask them these questions, it'd be like, oh no, you don't talk about that. You don't talk about physical appearance directly to somebody. You don't mention these things. You don't talk about people's age or weight or marriage relationship status. But because of kind of the history of China about, marriage relationships, the importance of family, the importance of marriage and these social ties, because it's such a prominent thing in everyday life, there is a big drive of that in the conversation, right? Definitely every day. If you're in China and you're over the age of 25, you will get the question once a week at least, from people you know, people you don't know. Why aren't you married? Why don't you have kids? You'll get this question all the time. And again, it's kind of private from a Western standpoint, but it is also kind of the way of Chinese people trying to encourage you, right? They're trying to encourage you. They're trying to help. It just seems in a direct way sometimes, right? But I do like that. I do like the kind of investment though. It can be done very, very nicely. It can also be kind of intense when you get the question all the time. But again, all in good intentions. A few other things that come up a lot in conversation, kind of moving away from some of the social stuff. Some other things that do happen are, for example, you'll get asked quite often what your zodiac is, right? So in China, we have a different zodiac. I'm sure a lot of people are more familiar with it, but it doesn't go month by month like the Western kind of the zodiac of Taurus and Virgo and Aquarius and all these. It goes by year, right? So you have rotations every 12 years. You have a full rotation of different animals. The rat, the ox, the tiger, the rabbit, the dragon, snake, horse. These animals, right? And each animal, it's very similar. The zodiac does have like certain numerological, I can't say that word, implications. It does have like certain relationships that are, better or worse for you. There's, certain years that are more beneficial to have business and good fortune and places where you need to have risks. Like it's very similar to the zodiac. It's just on a more large scale, right? But that's often a really early question you might have in a relationship with someone. They might ask you what your zodiac sign is. And sometimes I think that that's like a nice way of asking how old you are, because they're not really directly asking you, because it's not always the question that comes up. There's still kind of a little bit of hesitation about that question sometimes. So it's like they'll ask you what your zodiac is, and then they can kind of figure it out discreetly. But that's always a really nice thing. It comes up all the time, and I think it's kind of like when people are trying to gauge a relationship and just kind of learn a little bit more about you, they do take the zodiac very seriously, and kind of understanding, what that means for your personality type, when you're born, so like how you were raised, maybe even the social connection that you two might have, because specific animal pairings are good together. And that is given a lot of credibility in China. I really like the zodiac system. I find that it's not vague enough like some of the zodiacs that I've read in the past, where it can just be applied to everyone. There are like really specific connections that it will make to business, really very specific connections it will make to social connections. And I think it's a really, really very rich history of that, and I think that there is something there. There is something that that can be applied and kind of learned from, right? So zodiac system, that is something that will come up quite often. And if you're going to be traveling in China, if you're going to be having these relationships, it is really good to be kind of familiar with that, just on a basic level even, because people will ask you that. People ask you what your zodiac is. And you can ask them, and it's kind of a neat bonding experience where it just gives you a subject to kind of talk about or kind of, uncover together. So, which brings me to maybe the biggest tradition in China that's just underlying the fabric of everything is the lunar calendar. Okay, the lunar calendar, which is why, we refer to Chinese New Year as the Lunar New Year or Spring Festival. Normally happens around, during the New Year kind of period, celebrated on the lunar calendar. So it kind of fluctuates every year, normally somewhere between like January 20th, February 10th, somewhere in that area. It moves a little bit because the lunar calendar is more stable. And because of leap years in the Gregorian calendar and the Western kind of calendar, because of the shift in it every year. It always kind of ends up on a different day. It kind of switches around. But if you have like a Chinese phone, for example, the calendar, underneath the calendar, it gives you the date in the lunar calendar. It's like a just built-in feature. So you can look at like what is the lunar kind of cycle right now. And there is a lot of importance on that. Like there's a lot of, how do you say, like fortuitous days that are mentioned. There's a lot of days that, like, if it's a good luck day, there'll be a lot of marriages that happen that day. Like there are a lot of arrangements that are built around the lunar calendar because it is the way that people are tied into nature, kind of culturally. And so the lunar calendar is kind of the more balanced system for seasons and kind of the fluctuations of your environment, right? So we follow the lunar calendar, but that spreads into, like I said, for the Zodiac, it also goes into how you plan things, how you arrange dates, how you look at your birthday, right? So your birthday normally will go off the lunar calendar, which makes it super complicated to figure out someone's birthday because it changes every year. And people use the excuse to get 2 or 3 birthdays. But if you can figure out someone's birthday on the lunar calendar and be able to remember that, it's like extra street cred, extra brownie points, right? And another interesting thing with the lunar year, we do call it Chinese New Year. We call it the Lunar New Year. Lunar New Year is definitely more clear because that gives the idea of that, coming around the cycle of whatever. I think it's 12 or I think it's 13. I'm not exactly sure. 13 months. But then when you go through a whole system of that, you have a full lunar year. And we refer to it as Chinese New Year. I think people have adopted Spring Festival and Lunar New Year to be more inclusive because China is not the only country that celebrates the Lunar New Year. Of course, a lot of Asian countries do. I think that Chinese people it's just kind of because that's what it's really well known for, it becomes Chinese New Year. But there's kind of this semantic issue and PC kind of modern communication that has to be inclusive, but China doesn't really exclude anybody from celebrating. It's just like the terminology that kind of developed, right? After all, China is known as the center country, right? So it's very much kind of involved in being the hub of connection for everyone. So I think China takes a lot of pride in that as well. So Chinese New Year, fine, acceptable. Lunar New Year, also acceptable. Okay, maybe a little more clear, I suppose. Spring Festival, again, the beginning of spring. But from there, there's so many traditions that happen around this period, right? So you do have like the day of course, you have the fireworks to kind of bring in the new year. That's very similar, kind of scaring away bad spirits and omens and kind of awakening the energy of the new year. Very similar. I think that's kind of uniform all across different cultures. If it's not fireworks, it's knocking on wood. It's making loud noise. It's banging pots and pans. Even in some cultures, like there's always that kind of idea of making noise to cleanse a space or burning something to cleanse a space. Right? There's always some kind of connection to the environment where you're kind of establishing your presence, whether it's in a location or a time period. Right? I think that's pretty uniform. But there's other traditions as far as like not sweeping or washing clothes on the first few days of the New Year's because you don't want to give away your good luck, right? You don't throw things away on the first, second, third day because there is kind of a period of retention where you have to make sure you don't throw away your kind of new year, right? You have to hold on to it for a little while. The firework thing has kind of changed a little bit because I remember when the fireworks would go off before, there'd just be a mess everywhere. And lately they've kind of cut down a lot on that in China and kind of started to regulate it a little more because it was just so many people and so many fireworks that some of those traditions have kind of shrunk and they become more internalized or they've adapted. Like right now, instead of doing fireworks, you can buy strings of balloons. And what you do is you wind a rope and it pulls the string towards you, and as the balloons come towards you, they pass through like a tunnel that has sharp objects like nails or something like that, and it pops all the balloons, right? And so you just pull this string and they come towards you, and it very much similar to fireworks, except for all of the mess is contained to one little area. And a lot easier to clean up, not going to be really wasteful as far as like smoke and pollution and everything. So there are like ways that some of the traditions have adapted, but they're still practiced, right? But again, the biggest ones around the dinner table, celebrating, going to the graves and sweeping them, cleaning them, putting new incense, burning fake money, burning even different things like fake clothes, all these different models of houses, special items you want to give to your loved ones in the next life. There's still this kind of honoring your ancestors by returning to the grave during Chinese New Year, but also during special holidays, certain times of the year, to clean their space and offer anything, like that could be used in the next life. So there's these kind of traditions as well, which all have to do with the lunar calendar. So they'll come up on different days, different periods, and they're practiced, right? And Chinese New Year is just full of practices, right? Like Chinese New Year will happen, like I said, kind of late to early January, February, and then it'll go on until the first full moon, the first kind of moon cycle, which is called Yuan Xiao, which is the 15th day of the new year. This year it'll actually be, I think next week, next week I think it's actually going to be on the 15th because New Year was on the 1st. So we'll have Yuan Xiao, which is the first full moon. It is the small circle holiday. And you'll eat this kind of sweet ball soup. You could have like bean paste or the peanut sauce or chocolate even. They got lots of different kinds, and prepared in a soup, warmed up, and really, really good, really sweet, and kind of like I think that's kind of like the finishing celebration of Spring Festival, and then everything starts to carry back on. But Chinese New Year could be a pretty long holiday. I know like my daughter Selena, she got off school. It's been a couple weeks now already. She's been out of school, I think like 2 or 3 weeks now. She'll have right after Yuan Xiao, she'll go back to school. So there is a pretty big winter holiday, of around a month that everyone gets off. So there's quite a lot of travel. A lot of people return to their old home because they go back to their parents, they go back to their family. If they need to visit the graves of their ancestors, have this kind of social connection. And very much the whole country is traveling at this time of year. So it can get pretty busy. I think it's even known as the world's largest human migration every year. And it only gets bigger and bigger because travel is getting so much easier every year, right? There's more high-speed rail, more airports being built. The infrastructure for road construction in China is very, very, very big. So every year it's easier and easier for people to return home and to travel. The quality of life is getting better. So all these traditions are very much alive and practiced a lot, especially around New Year's. This may be the most important holiday, right? But there's a few others. You have your Dragon Boat Festival, you have your Mid-Autumn Festival, kind of like your harvest time of year where you eat mooncakes and a similar kind of party. You have your kind of political holidays, at the beginning of May, the beginning of October. They're kind of scattered out throughout the year. A lot of smaller ones based on personal holidays or family birthdays and things like this as well, right? And all of those will be celebrated, and they all kind of have their own unique tradition based around them, right? Also, one of the biggest things with the lunar calendar is probably with weddings, right? There is a lot of numerology, and even though arranged marriage isn't necessarily always practiced anymore, like I do know there are some places that, there is very much like a family practice of finding the proper spouse for their kids. And so there is kind of like the family does have a hand in the relationship a lot more than it does in the West, which is, again, why I think your elders, which is why people you know in China will ask you questions like, why aren't you married? Why don't you have kids? These kind of things, because there is this still kind of leftover tradition of the family having a hand in your relationship. It might not necessarily be that they sign away your marriage while you're still young, right? Like that there was arranged marriage at one point, and it would be looking at the lunar calendar where they would decide that, this person is a good match for this person because of their birthdays, because of the time of the year, because of this kind of cosmological connection, right? Cosmic connection, right? And so there are like these histories of arranged marriage, but because that's not necessarily the practice, and people do have their own kind of preference, is definitely more important now. It's not always just signed away when you're still young, but there is that leftover kind of interest and investment of the family in your relationship, right? And so, sometimes relationships can go pretty quick if the family's not behind it. So it is really important to have like a good connection with the families before sometimes the people even consider having a relationship. The family is looked at first. I know that's a big thing here, where like in the West, it's very much like revolution, like the you pick your spouse and the family has to deal with it. And there is a lot of a lot of jokes about that, and about, mother-in-laws and how there's always these kind of disastrous relationships, of course, played up in modern media. So it's always kind of the second thought, right? Like you have your relationship and then you have to figure out how to balance the family. But here it's very much the family has to be balanced first, or there's really not much potential for that connection, right? It can still happen, but again, those traditions are still, while not fully practiced, there are kind of this inherited, kind of filtered down version of it. Similar like the fireworks, like they're adapting, but they're still present, right? So that's pretty important. When you get into weddings, of course, there's a ton of practices there. A lot of them still do the fireworks, the celebrations, the serving of tea to your new in-laws. There is normally a dowry. So when you give money for the bride, there is still this kind of thing. It's adapted into kind of a more playful experience. It's not necessarily like giving the family of the bride money and livestock and rice and things like that. It's not necessarily that, but there is kind of this like you have to pay your dues to the family when you get married. And so the husband goes to pick up the bride from their family's house, and to get in the door they have to throw money through the door, and when the family thinks it's enough, they open the door, but then you have to go through the bedroom door as well. And so there's a whole bunch of traditions around marriage in China. To dig into that, I might save that for another episode, because I have some interesting stories about that. That's pretty intense. But again, you can just see like the practice there. The tradition is still very much part of the daily conversation, right? Very much so. Also with New Year's, there are a few things like, you have your good omens. And so not for the squeamish, but there are things like, having a chunk of meat, having like a pig being slaughtered at the beginning of the year, for example, is a pretty common practice, especially in the kind of villages and traditional families. That'll be like the family will purchase it, and even in some cases the family will go to do the slaughtering, right? And so that's like normally a pretty auspicious way to begin a new year, right? Because you do that, and then it's not only the event of doing it with the family, but also because everything is used of the pig, from blood to organs to the ears, and everything is used. And in that sense, there's kind of this idea of nothing is wasted, everything is appreciated and kind of not taken for granted, right? And also shared with the whole family, often the extended family, right? So there's a lot of gift giving, there's a lot of practices, there's a lot of kind of tradition tied up into that as well, because that is kind of like the very old school thing that would be done. It's still passed down and carried into today, right? Not always every single family, but I do know it's, even if you're not doing the actual slaughtering, there is kind of the idea of around this time of year, people are stocking. So they're buying meat and drying it. They're kind of replenishing their stores in some way, right? And also offering gifts to family members. You know, in the case of rice, alcohol, the tea, the essentials, right? The most commonly used necessities of living in China. It's always seen as a very good relationship when you offer those things, because you're kind of giving them not necessarily what they want, you're giving them what they need, you're like improving their quality of life directly, right, with those gifts. So those are always really nice. Yeah, and just to go further into that just for a moment, with everything tied into the lunar year, everything is very much tied into the cycle of change in seasons, in the time of year, in the weather of each day. Everything is very closely tied to that too. So you'll hear people commonly talking about like the solar cycle of the year, like the change in the solstice, the different season changes. You even got things where it's like today is the awakening of the insects. This is the first day of frost. You know, this is the slight cold, or the climax of yang energy of the year, the driest day of the year. There are these things that are kind of laid out in the Chinese 24 solar calendar points. And that's a really interesting thing to look at as well, just to kind of see the connection that most Chinese kind of families have to their nature directly around them, right? Kind of very, again, looking at those markers of the year to say, now we know that this is happening, so we need to start our harvest. We need to start preparing for winter. We need to be adjusting, right? And so there is kind of that direct connection to the environment, which I think is really nice. Like it's a good system to have that connection with. I think sometimes in the West, everything's so disconnected and everything's so climate controlled, literally, that we often don't really pay much attention to the weather, and only in the sense that we have to get through it, right? We have to tame it in some way. Here, similar, but again, more about alignment, more about finding that balance, right? Yeah, and that balance brings us right into Feng Shui. But real quickly, before I get into that, I do want to mention, if you guys are interested in these kind of conversations, if you have like more detailed questions, specific subjects you'd like to go into, or like, for example, those 24 solar seasons, if you want more information on those, more resources, and more kind of places to direct your attention to, join us on the Discord channel. I have it's absolutely free Discord channel called the Wudang Community. There's links in this video if you're listening to this through YouTube, but you can also search on Discord with that just for Wudang Community, or the Ways of Wudang. You should be able to find as well. And you can join the community, join the group. There's places to ask questions. There's resources that are archived there, just to give you lots of study material, and another way to kind of connect you to Wudang, especially because travel is still restricted. Those rules, regulations haven't been lifted yet. So I'm hoping that in some small way I can bring a piece of Wudang, a piece of Chinese culture to you wherever you are. So if you're interested in these kind of subjects I'm just kind of touching on throughout this episode, do join us there, and you can get a lot more kind of access, right? And a lot more perspective, and especially resources on these different subjects. So I try to share kind of the things I've read, different books, different articles, websites, different things like that. So there's kind of a dedicated forum, if you will, for all those different subjects, and a bunch more as well. So Ways of Wudang, or the Wudang Community on Discord. Join us. All right. Yeah, and then after that, I just wanted to mention real quickly, of course, Feng Shui. So you really can't do much of anything without addressing feng shui in China. Like this goes into the practice of architecture, how buildings, how banks, how hotels, how cities are laid out, also how your personal house is designed. Feng shui has to do with, wind and water and the proper circulation and influence of both, right? So because everything in China has to do with these two elements, we have to talk about the history of China controlling the rivers of China and how each one of these rivers kind of can cause a lot of flooding. It can cause a lot of turmoil to the cities that are built around them. There is a very big cultural implication of what it means to kind of, I don't want to say control necessarily, but to definitely to tame the rivers and the waterways. Once that was done, that becomes the place where China historically grew, because now because these systems of dams and barges and also just the taming of these rivers was established. Now there's no potential danger here anymore, and everything can flourish, right? Because trade, irrigation, farming, all these things can happen a lot more streamlined, right? And so there's a really big cultural idea of balancing your workspace to protect against the potential dangers of things like wind and water, right? But this idea went a lot deeper in practice and became kind of the way of balancing not just the physical sense of water and wind, but also the kind of energetic influence of those as well. And so very much like balancing the forces of energy that come into your home, right? And so there's a lot of examples of this, and feng shui is a very big subject that I'll probably dedicate another episode to in the future to go in a little more detail. But just to say that, everyone kind of establishes this balance in their home, how things are laid out, the arrangement of tables, the room layout, the objects that are put in there, like the furniture. Things are laid out in a certain way to create a balance that promotes a good energy, right? You walk into a room and you feel welcome, but you're also not losing energy, right? Like certain things can't face the door. Certain things should be oriented in a way that when guests are there, they feel included in the activity, right? So there is kind of a conscious awareness of the, how would you say, home, of the homestead, of the layout of your inner life, right? Feng Shui, again, I think those kind of relationships tie into the family hierarchy and this titling as well. Everything is structured, right? And so it goes from, just how you communicate with your relatives all the way down to how you, design your bedroom. But again, it's very, very much on everyone's mind, and having those best optimum conditions is very important, right? So feng shui is something that will be practiced, and kind of even the lay person who might not be very, very well versed in these practices, even they will have some kind of connection to it, right? Like even they'll be aware of it, or they'll maybe even hire someone to help them design or consult with someone on like what would be the proper or best condition to arrange something, right? Whether it's a wedding, whether it's a new house, whether it's a new career opportunity, all these things will be balanced in some way. So feng shui has to do with the more physical representation of your home or business. But again, it's another way that people kind of have that conversation about the culture just in their everyday life. So feng shui, really, really important. So now I'm going to get to what I would consider probably the most important cultural place in China, and that is the dinner table. Okay. Here is where relationships are made and potentially broken. So there's just so much of Chinese culture that is just centered literally around the dinner table and food and drink. Okay. So we've talked about tea. We've talked about, how that is conducted and the relationships that can be established there. But I want to specifically talk just about the dinner table, about food etiquette. I know that this is a big thing, especially for Western students coming here. I think I've had this talk quite a bit with my own students, with my family, like talking about different things like this, because it is definitely, it's the one thing that no matter where you are, you have to do. You got to eat, right? There is this, of course, social connection there because meals are taken as a family, right? I don't even think that it's a very common thing at all to have meals that you take to your room or you sit at a living room, watch TV. Like, while this might happen during holidays, especially because it gets pretty rambunctious, generally speaking, every meal is considered a family meal. Even like breakfast, going to a restaurant or something like that. Like there's more and more now, I suppose, especially with like delivery options, there's more of like a individual based meal thing. But generally speaking, if you're at home, every meal is a family meal, right? Especially here in Wudang, right? Like everything, even the school, everything happens together, right? And optimally, I think that would be what everyone would prefer in China, is just having all your meals be a very big, dedicated part of your day, right? Breakfast happens early. A lot of people don't cook breakfast. They typically go out, but they invite people to have breakfast. They meet people. They qingke, which means you host somebody. So you would pay for someone to come with you. Not like a stranger. I mean, like your friend, right? Like, so you would pay for breakfast. And there's not very much of this splitting the bill that ever happens in China. People fight passionately to pay the bill. The higher price the bill, the more hard they fight. So there's very little of this calculating the bill and splitting it because everyone's equal. No, it's I'm paying for you and you better like it. So there's definitely like a big culture of just that. Okay, so which I think we have to talk about as well. But in general, the dinner table is where all these connections are established, essentially, right? Whether that's business, happens over meals, whether that's family, every day around that table, or even, whether it's a special occasion like a wedding, you'll be served. I went to a few weddings and I'm typically served food during the wedding, which is always a strange thing because, they've kind of adopted some Western practices of marriage, just to kind of create it more of a kind of party atmosphere. But the ceremony is happening a lot of times during a banquet, during a meal. So everyone's being served food while the ceremony is happening. But everything happens around food. Everything happens around food all year round. Depending on where you are, that might change. But like whether you're eating hot pot, where you're eating a hot meal out of a community kind of soup pan, where everything's cooked individually, one by one, together. You eat communally with chopsticks. So there are dishes that sit on a table that might revolve around and you serve yourself, but everything is done as a group, right? Unless you're like in a business, in a cafeteria type of setting, okay, there are individual portions. Okay, there are this as well. But for the most part, most restaurants are set around this kind of like family meal standard, even when you go out, right? So it's like you share dishes. So that is, very, very important to understand the context. But not just the meal, what you're eating, and that kind of connection that's established there from, paying the bill to inviting people, to, brokering business deals while you break bread. All these things are important. But even the structure around the dinner table, right? So, for example, the sitting order. How people sit at the table is very important. For example, if you're going to stay at home, there is typically a VIP position at the table. If you're at someone's house in the West, there always seems to be like the host of the home normally has their kind of established seat. In China, that position would probably be like dedicated or forced upon whoever is the eldest, whoever is in the most like high status position, the guest at the time. It could be different depending on the situation, but typically there is kind of a best position. And there's a few rules for this. So basic rule, if you have kind of a balanced layout in your home, would be the north position, right? So the highest position. But most of the time what's followed would actually be the point farthest away from any, how should I put that? The farthest away from any movement. So if you have a restaurant, for example, that would typically be the farthest away from where the food is served, right? Kind of the back of the table in a sense. In that position, they're kind of the focal point of the room. So when you enter, they can see everyone at the table. They can see kind of the forefront, and also anyone who enters the room, they're kind of the first face you see. They're right in the front. So it gives them kind of the optimum seating. Also, if someone's serving food, there's no food being served next to you, so you don't have to continually move at the table to have, the dishes be laid out. So there is kind of like a VIP position, right? Again, it could be the elder, it could be the leader in the situation. It could be shifu, for example, if you're in a martial arts school, could be your guest. But there is kind of a proper seating. And a lot of times it'll be forced on people, and you also have to make sure they sit first. So they're kind of taken care of and they're comfortable. So there's kind of like a haggling for that position as well. Also, when you do start eating, that pecking order does carry on. So if food is served, a lot of times the first serving will go to that person, to your guest, or to your VIP at the time, right? And so there is kind of this, trying to always be the best host, always trying to make the guest feel the most welcome, serving things for them, offering the first bite, the first drink, giving that position of honor to this person. Really, really important. And it can be kind of frowned upon in some circles to just jump that order or to not pay attention to that, because it's so ingrained in just the fabric of social gathering. If you don't pay attention to that, it can be really seen as, improper and not appropriate. You're really gonna mess up your connection with everyone if you don't understand these things, right? I know that when we travel with Sifu, for example, it's always, trying to put all the decision into his control and allowing him to kind of have the most important position. And Sifu's had this for a while. He has disciples. He's traveled. He's been the guest of honor quite a lot. And I remember we traveled in Beijing and we did this, and everyone knows this practice. And we're all martial arts students. We're all training all day, and I think food for us is the most important thing, even more so. Whereas if you wanted my class to participate in an event or some performance, or you want us to do something for you as a favor, the number one way to ensure that happening was to offer us food, because food was the currency, right? It was the best thing that we could have at any moment, because you train full time like that. It's just you're never really full. So we would go out and eat with Sifu, and of course everyone's frothing at the mouth waiting for the meal, and we would always kind of position everything in front of Sifu and wait for him to recognize and wait for him to take a bite so we could start eating. And I think Sifu sometimes does it as a test and a challenge, but also at a certain point he just takes a bite and he's like, oh yeah, okay, you guys just eat, don't wait. So there is kind of this, there are moments where it's not necessarily essential. It's just the appropriate way of kind of expressing your care once again, right? Of course, the more you can, bring these traditions into your practice, the more you can, if you learn how to use chopsticks, if you ask people, have you eaten? If you invite people to meals, if you call them by family names, If you do these kinds of things and you understand, when their birthday is, you've learned the lunar calendar, you can pay attention to some of these kind of fortuitous days and events of the year. It's just a really great way to connect yourself to the culture and also see all the little ways that it's influential in the everyday life, right? I think dinner table is one of the most important places to see those practices because it's where everyone connects, right? Alcohol is drank in China typically at meal times, right? It's not necessarily always where people have beer and get together and hang out at a bar. There is some of that, but I think the tradition is definitely dinner time is, drinking with each other. Sometimes you'll see in some books like you'll substitute rice and have alcohol, beer, rice wine, baijiu, things like this. Okay, so there is some of that. It's not essential, but it definitely is like during holiday times more common, right? And so understanding that kind of how to serve, if you're going to cheers with someone, there is kind of that idea of bringing your cup lower than their cup when you touch glasses, just to show that, you're trying to honor them, holding things with two hands when you're served, to say thank you, to also show that you're very appreciative of this moment, offering kind of toasts to people. So, toasting to people's health and wishing them good holidays and good fortune and good luck and things like this is all very, very common and really essential, especially during those social gatherings around the dinner table, right? And so just so much of family life and business life and those social connections happen around the dinner table. It's really important to have those connections and to nurture them, right? Not only will you establish a good relationship with everyone, but you'll also get great food all the time. So definitely necessary information. But lastly, just to go into that, there is the practice of gift giving in China. And I think that besides all these little things of just kind of showing how you care, there is still the practice of bringing gifts to people, especially around holidays, less around birthdays, things like Christmas, birthday, these kind of things, less common, starting to gain more popularity, but typically gifts will be given around birthdays and New Year's and big holidays like this. Getting a new house, having a baby, all these kind of really big events are often seen with the gift giving of red bags. So that is the go-to tradition in China. Wedding, again, the dowry, giving the red bags to the family. Red bags full of money. So that's always kind of seen as the best gift, the most uniform tradition, I should say. Again, sometimes during holidays, you do have, like I mentioned, the essentials. People do bring fruit. They do bring, like, the apples are seen as a good luck symbol. But also, again, centered around the dinner table, if you are traveling somewhere new or somewhere far away from your home, a lot of times you could bring the delicacies of your area in China, bringing special food, special fruit, special vegetables even, that are difficult to find or are different quality, bringing those to a family, bringing tea, bringing oil, bringing milk, bringing rice. All these things are actually pretty common gifts, especially if you're traveling, right? You're returning to your old home or you're visiting extended family or friends. That's a really common gift as well. But usually red bags is the go-to, right? I know my mom, when I first went back to the States with my wife, she knew some of the traditions. They had all practiced up on their chopsticks so we could have meals together. And I know that she also prepared a lot of things in red bags. Even if they were presents, they would be red paper, so everything was always established. And it was one of those things that really did, to this day, means a lot to my wife. And that's always like a really good way to just, doing that extra step to show that consideration, that care, right? That makes people feel really, really welcome here. And it's really, really important to the fabric of culture, just to have that connection, right? It's kind of like an ICU moment. You're taking care of that identity. Because if it's one thing, China and Chinese people are very, very, they very closely identify with their culture, right? And it means a lot. If you look at the language in China, there's a written language designed so that all of the different parts of China can have a written format to communicate with each other, right? And now we have Pudonghua, which is Mandarin, which is the common language, literally means the common language. And that is kind of like the standard now. But the reason the written standard was established was to connect everyone and allow them to still have their individual dialects, right? So everyone who knows about Chinese, especially if you're learning the language, you know that Chinese has some of the out of languages in the world it has some of the biggest variations in dialect, right? You've got like your Cantonese, but you also have like old home dialects. You have like local regional dialects, where even from here, I could travel an hour away and be in a part of China that would be maybe difficult to communicate with each other for at least a little while if they didn't speak Mandarin, right? The writing would be uniform, but because that spoken language can be preserved a little bit from district to district, region to region, province to province, there is a lot of identity tied into that. There's colloquialism, there's slang, there's terminology that would be used slightly differently or pronounced differently even. And that is a very proud point of the Chinese identity, is having that connection to your community, right? That's really important. I mentioned China is referred to as 中国, which means the center country, right? That is, how we say it in Chinese. That is the Chinese name. Of course, China is the English name that was given to it because of porcelain and things like that. But the name of China is 中国, the center country. And it is very important to Chinese culture to have that connection, not just to their own individual kind of regional location and history and community, but also to take into consideration the connection that inspires throughout not just China, but the neighboring countries and today around the world, right? China is very, very proud to have a rich, like the most well recorded historically culture. And to be able to have these practices that not just benefit and give them identity and structure and promote their well-being and quality of life, but also that other people can practice. And, it's not something that, while maybe it was designed here and established here historically, it's something that can be incorporated into all walks of life, all ages, all seasons, all geographic locations. Everything has a time and a place in Chinese culture. And I think and I hope that that unspoken language is becoming more universal. And I hope that people can continue to study it and learn from it and incorporate it into your daily life. Because a lot of these traditions, while they have very structured, how would I say, like, you need to seriously study them to understand them to their deepest potential. There are ways that these traditions have been passed down and they've been filtered and purified into everyday practices that, even without knowing and being able to recite large philosophical treatises or being able to memorize classical texts or alchemical charts or the solar cosmic connections, without being able to recite and do all of this divination, there are aspects and pieces of that practice that have made its way into, your home It's made its way into your dinner table. It's made its way into your relationships, and into the way that you perceive the world while living in China. And I think that those practices can really benefit you, wherever you are, listening to this podcast. So I do hope that these things continue to be practiced and learned, and hopefully some of these things can be brought into your life, because there are so many things we can learn from them, and so many ways that we can connect to ourselves and our community and our environment once again. Over the centuries, they've been filtered down into their most pure aspect, but the guideline has always been to direct you towards some kind of balance, some way that you can achieve good luck, longevity, and happiness. And these three things are very much in line with my hopes and aspirations for this podcast are. Hopefully I'm offering a little bit of light, a little bit of perspective, and some new thoughts for you. So with that, I think there's nothing left to say except here's to finding that balance. One cup at a time. Gombe. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, also available wherever you get your podcasts. Support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon and get access to resources, classes, and more. Keep the conversation going with hashtag Talks-Unfiltered, or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. Links are in the description. I'll talk with you next time for another cup of tea.